does a youth development approach or positive youth development, positive youth justice promote accountability? How can it promote accountability? And how can it attend to the needs of victims? How do we do that?
Well, I think you have to attend to both of those. And I think if I could show you, if I had a nice report right now showing you that this county implemented positive youth justice in full, and here are the results, and I could show you, here's the proportion of people who had finished high school by the age of 18 or even 20, and that number climbs. If I could show you the proportion who were working full time by the time they were 25, had graduated from college or some kind of other training program by the time they were 25. And I showed you that graph and it was going up. And then I showed you a graph showing how many people were living in their own home and raising a family by the age of 28. And that graph also went up. You would start to think I had found something useful. Even when you hear a story of one case where someone was harmed by a 16-year-old, you would have all those graphs in the back of your mind and think, no, I understand that's horrible that happened, but we have to hold on to this model because it's making the whole community healthier and safer. And you would try to incorporate those. What happens right now when someone tells that one story about a horrible case is that all these good ideas just get tossed aside and we run back to the 1800s and start talking about having more bed space. And so I do think, and it's self-serving perhaps because I'm a researcher, but I do think if we build the evidence over time that's persuasive and has a story behind it, people would listen to it and not be so eager to throw over the good ideas for the old.
Thank you for that. And so how, right now, as you're aware, California is in a realignment stage, and a lot of young people who were formerly at the Department of Juvenile Justice are now at the local level. And there's youth with high needs, histories of trauma, and with serious offenses, sometimes violence. How is positive youth justice a good approach for youth with high needs and those issues?
So as I showed you the data, when you are in the deep end, you're going to have more mental health issues, more substance use issues. You do need to provide those restorative clinical approaches. But that doesn't mean when someone leaves a facility at age 19 or 20 or something, that now that they've had treatment for mental health and substance abuse, they're ready to go. They still have to have a way to plug into society, a way of feeling belonging, skill development. All those things are still relevant. We delude ourselves into thinking we're protecting the public safety if we just deal with their more serious clinical problems, even trauma. Trauma is essential to deal with, but it's not an explanation of why one young person ends up in a locked room and another does not. It's a risk factor, but you cannot put a young person on a path to successful adulthood just by addressing their risk factors.
Okay, so kind of related to that, when we think about attaching and belonging, I think about young people having opportunities and connections and support in pro-social ways in community. But for a lot of young people in this, and for practitioners on this call, we're serving youth who are in custody, sometimes for longer periods of time. And so want to hear your thoughts about how do you set the stage? How do you provide positive youth justice within facilities, and how should we think about setting the stage for reentry and continuing that into community? So any thoughts along those lines would be great.
I think, and I have never worked in the deep end, so I should say that I've never been full-time in a facility of committed young people. But I think if we did an honest tour or look at what a young person's day-to-day life is in a facility, it's mostly about compliance, obedience, and keeping your head down and not being noticed as much as possible. I have been to some facilities that focus on positive engagement. And I was once at a place, there was actually another private facility that organized young people into learning how to work on bicycles, and then took them on a backcountry rural bicycle tour. And boy, just watching the motivation and seeing how young people responded to that was revolutionary. So if lock facilities could be more than sit down, shut up, and do what we tell you, and instead, do you know how to do this? Would you like to know how to do this? Let's work on that together as a group and build skills and activities that get them to collaborate with one another so they believe or start to experience the fact they're part of that group. I think that would be helpful. So just because you're in a locked facility doesn't mean these ideas are irrelevant. You just have to balance them with all the other concerns about security and safety, dealing with trauma, everything else.
Great. A couple more questions, and then there's really good stuff in the chat that I'm going to try to scan through and get and lift up some questions there as well. But what type of partnerships are necessary to make PYJ work in a robust fashion?
Well, again, I think about this in terms of evidence and proving that it's effective, which means if you don't have access to school records, you're not going to be able to do anything about intellectual performance. And in a locked facility, you can do that because you are the school in many places. But in the broader community, you need access to school attendance and performance, even grades. And it's really hard to work with local school systems to share information. But that graph I described earlier, showing by the time they're 18, they've finished high school, that would be a wonderful thing to have. And you cannot do it just by doing surveys and follow-up contacts. You need the bureaucracies to tie together. You also need schools to recognize that just because someone's justice involved doesn't mean they're a lost cause and you stick them in a room and tell them to be quiet. It means they're more challenging for the teachers, but that challenge is worthwhile to put in more energy for that young person in the classroom. Same thing with work. So again, we want people to have the ability to be independent and be able to work and have a job by the time they're in their 20s. And to do that and to show that you did it, you need to have whatever the state agency or local agency that monitors and stores all those labor force records tied in with criminal justice records so you can establish that. And again, that's really hard. And it's not hard in every country, by the way. I was talking to a colleague from Denmark who told me in that country, once you have their ID number, you can tie all these data sets together and prove anything. And at first I thought that was a great idea. And then I remembered who our policymakers are. And I thought I would not want our governments to have that ability to tie all those records together. So that means you'd have to have a wall between the research community and the government where you would get the records, tie them together to be able to prove the impact of all these efforts. But then you wouldn't want your state department to harvest all that information and have those records to go after people with. So it gets trickier in our setting.
Okay, finally, and a question that's probably music to your ears as a researcher and evaluator, how do we know that PYJ is working? Has it been operationalized to the extent it should? Do we have the tools to evaluate it? Should we be moving more in that direction? How do we know it's working?
Yeah, I would not use working. I would not use that verb. I wouldn't say a lot. A number of jurisdictions have embraced these concepts and are pursuing them. But no one, I think, yet has put together an integrated program of policy and practice reform with research to show that it works. Mostly people respond just like I did, that this makes so much sense. This is what we should be doing. And it's really hard to fight the market dominance of the clinical field. And I don't begrudge them their market dominance because and this gets into a little bit of research talk, but one of the reasons why the clinical field has more powerful outcomes and can tell a policymaker they're effective is that they measure things on a one-to-one basis. So they have a treatment program, 30 kids come into the treatment program, they deliver the program, they know they are because they can see it, and then they follow up those 30 kids and see how many get rearrested. What you do with that kind of research is not find the holy grail of public safety, but you do find a measurable improvement. And so people can report back, we have statistically significant results, and then all the state legislators say, great, fabulous, here's more money. And that's because they're measuring one-to-one change. And I don't think anyone who's worked in the justice system very long thinks that's the all-time, all-purpose solution to public safety, is dealing with people on a one-to-one basis, because we have to deal with the environments and the community context that young people are living in and their families are living in, because all those stressor and inequities and good old-fashioned American racism contributes to all the problems that result in youth behavior problems. And you can't pretend that you'll just fix that problem by waiting until a young person's in trouble and then providing them with a therapeutic model and everything's fine, because there are more coming, because that neighborhood is hell to live in, and we know that, but our policymakers refuse to fix neighborhoods or deal with social and racial inequities in this country, so we just keep repopulating the system. And if you think that way, as I do, it's easy to get just broken down by pessimism and you can't go anywhere, because it just seems like it's never going to be fixable. But I think the positive youth justice model, if we could show those policymakers that we made a difference, maybe they would be more supportive and start to build in those resources and those assets for young people, instead of just thinking about trauma, mental health, and substance use.
Okay, well, we have a fair amount of time, so I'm just going to work through some of the questions. And one of the early questions or maybe a statement to a certain extent, was I'll speak to. Sometimes detainment is needed to get the help they need, but the issue is that the juvenile system right now is not working. Have no halls available except one, and that one is so understaffed that it is creating a very dangerous situation for the kids and staff here. So a lot of challenges noted here right now in this moment. We are moving too slow to address this issue at this present moment. Although substance abuse and mental health are greatly impact our youth, you are forgetting those involved in gangs, foster care, or in poverty. And wonder if you might want to speak to that. I mean, one of the things that I've often felt is that positive youth development, positive youth justice, opportunities, belonging, and attaching is exactly to me, the antidote for as a gang alternative, or sort of recognizing the underlying need that a young person is trying to meet through a maladaptive, approach of gang involvement. But there's a lot there in that statement, and I think this is a challenging time to implement these things. So I don't know if you have the answers, but I do want to make sure we're giving time to recognize those challenges that a lot of people on this call are grappling with.
Yeah, it is a good question. And the analogy to foster care, I think, is right on point. After I worked in the juvenile court for a year in Eugene, I got an MSW in Portland and worked for the State Child Welfare Authority in Portland, and was a foster care worker, which was both educational and horrifying. And I think it is exactly parallel to the question about secure facilities and young people, because I was young and enthusiastic, and I thought my role was to keep kids at home, get them out of foster care if they're in, restore the family, support the family. But I also knew that my enthusiasm for that could end up hurting someone, because at some point you have to recognize the horrible reality that this 2-year-old is not safe here, and have the court remove them. Now, that whole system is, of course, more likely to go for removal with families of color and poor families. And that is an obvious parallel to juvenile justice, youth justice. But it doesn't mean that you sacrifice the 2-year-old on your, your altar of equity and inclusion. You have to pay attention to the dangers that in, again, a overstressed, under-resourced community, people are going to get hurt. And sometimes in the youth justice system, it's unwanted. You try to avoid it, but sometimes secure confinement is necessary. If we all had complete trust in the decision-making process to decide who goes into secure confinement and who doesn't, this wouldn't be as much of a problem. But we can all see, I mean, if you work in the system for any time at all, you see immediately all the flaws in the unprofessionalism and resource deprivation in the system. And you realize everyone's dealing with a crisis every day and maybe doing the best they can, but that's why you end up with kids going into locked facilities. And somehow that has to be balanced against public safety. And it's a constant challenge and a constant stress. So there's no easy answer. And I think recognizing the two sources of harm are important, and you just constantly try to balance.
So I'm going to take us to sort of the other end of the continuum and go upstream to diversion. There's a question here about diversion, like what do good diversion programs consist of? And I've been reading a lot of the research that shows that diversion is a very effective and it's a front of the system intervention that tends to be underutilized. I saw in reading your CV that you had done some work. There's a lot of places that I'm working right now are really concerned with gun violence. I saw that you evaluated a gun diversion program. So I want to also note that it's not just necessarily cases that we think are nickel and dime or very easy to handle, but can you speak to what a good diversion program consists of? And yeah, that's kind of the question.
Yeah, I also wrote an article I think I wrote it with someone, a friend, called Critical Diversion. And it's on my website, and I break copyright law all the time by just putting stuff on my website. So if you go there, jeffreybutts.net, you can get that article called Critical Diversion. And diversion often is a label used for a lot of different things. And it just means this young person was capable of being pushed further into the system, and we decided not to do that and instead do something else. So there could be diversion from arrest, there could be diversion from prosecution, from placement, from adjudication. So it's a very broad thing. But probably the way most people think about it is a young person at risk of out-of-home placement or at risk of severe disposition, whatever it is, and instead we do something informal or withhold adjudication pending completion of a program, that kind of diversion. And I think it's just an empirical question that you can show that if it's managed right, that the community gets really no further benefit from the more severe sanctions, especially placement, than it would from a well-crafted, well-managed, consistent diversion program. But you don't use diversion as a statement of rhetoric and goodness, and then label anything diversion as if people are going to sign up for it. You got to show that it's actually doing something productive. And I always end up talking about research. I guess that's how I ended up in this career. But I want the community to win, but I also know that we're really up against it, and it's gotten so much worse in the past few years that you can't just claim to have the best idea and all the policymakers come along and say, good for you, let's do that. They need to be basically hit over the head with enough evidence that they can't avoid it anymore. And even then, some of them will still deny that it ever happened, but still, we have to focus on the real world.
Well, at this point, I think I'd like to thank Dr. Jeff Butts for having this conversation with us. As I mentioned earlier, his website and his CV will make you tired to read, but you will see that he should be a real resource to you on a myriad of issues that are pertinent to us. And so with that, I'd like to turn to Director Lucero to close us and maybe reference some future opportunities.
Sure. And first of all, thank you all for hanging in there with us and staying the entire time. This was a very important discussion for us to really just start imagining our youth as a resource. We will be giving these webinars the first Monday of every month. So I hope that you will join us. We will make sure and send that invitation out. And thank you all for all of the hard work that you do, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.